And good evening, everybody, and welcome to this live book event here, sponsored by the Progressive Magazine in Madison, Wisconsin, and a Room of One's Own bookstore. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll be speaking in just a moment with Professor Noam Chomsky and renowned journalist David Barsamian. The book that has recently come out of their interviews together, Chronicles of Dissent, which covers the period in the 1980s and 1990s. And as you saw in the screen that was up there earlier, there's a new book coming out this August called Notes on Resistance, which will be new interviews coming up. And by the way, you can get a copy of Chronicles of Dissent with a donation to the Progressive Magazine, and you can go to our website, progressive.org/book-event, and you'll see a place where you can make a donation to the Progressive Magazine and receive a copy of this book sent to your home. It's also a place on our website where you can subscribe to the Progressive Magazine. This is our latest cover. The brand new April-May issue is just out in the mail right now. Particularly covering environmental issues and, as we always do, covering the people that are doing something about it, the movements and the organizations and the individuals that are working to address the climate crisis. Well, I'm very pleased to begin our program by introducing my longtime friend and colleague, David Barsamian, who has been, as we just noted, interviewing Noam Chomsky since 1984. And David, I think that you and I have known each other about that long as well. So welcome to the program, David Barsamian, joining us from Boulder, Colorado.
Hi, Norm. It's great to be with you and to have this terrific event, a room with the bookstore and the magazine, of course. And I'm very excited about having this book out. It's actually 3 books in one: Chronicles of Dissent, Keeping the Rabble in Line, and Class Warfare, spanning this 2-decade period, which is, I think, leading to Chomsky's political thought and philosophy that we've seen play out since those early interviews in the 80s, the depredations of capitalism, the continued undermining of democracy, the concentration of wealth and income, and the rich getting richer, and all the problems with neoliberalism. Noam was on all of those topics and more from a very early point. And so this book brings together, lots of information. It's really interesting that it almost didn't happen, the first interview, because I was having some technical difficulties and I had to hang up. And finally, I figured out how to do it. And that was the very first interview back in 1984. And as I say, Noam must hold the world record for doing interviews. He's always been so gracious and accommodating and willing to talk to people, as he has done so many times with me over the years.
And we should mention that Professor Chomsky is actually finishing up another interview right now with a different outlet, and so he's going to be joining us in just a moment. But before we get to that, David, tell us a little bit about your work with alternative radio, which has now been going for close to 40 years there in Boulder, Colorado, bringing voices, not only the voice of Noam Chomsky, but of so many other public intellectuals to the airwaves in community radio stations and some public radio stations around the country.
Well, I was not very happy with the media and the media landscape in the United States in the late 70s. And I hooked up with a local community radio station here in Boulder, Colorado, KGNU. And I started learning how to do radio, doing interviews, editing, formulating questions, producing, etc. And that led to national syndication of my program, Alternative Radio, in the mid-1980s, featuring voices like, of course, Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn and Edward Said and Iqbal Ahmed and Arundhati Roy and Vandana Shiva, a whole host of activists, intellectuals, scholars, people who are making a difference, and people who have been literally locked out of the media, who have had, very little opportunity to be in front of microphones or in front of cameras. So I saw alternative radio as a kind of an electronic umbilical cord, connecting with those voices and connecting people with those voices, because part of the way the system operates here in the country is to isolate people, to think that they're the only ones out there thinking these thoughts about capitalism or imperialism, etc. But in fact, they have many, many allies. So alternative radio is now in its 36th year. Just did a program on Extinction Rebellion, a very militant group in England, and they have their acolytes here in the United States. We just did a debate with Varoufakis, Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek politician and economist. He was talking to the Financial Times editor, Gillian Tett, about can capitalism be fixed? So every week there's a new program, and people are invited to go to the website, alternativeradio.org, alternativeradio.org. But also, I really want to encourage everyone tuning in to support the Progressive Magazine. This is a magazine that I've been connected with for many, many years. I'm very proud to say that many of my interviews have appeared in the Progressive. I was very close and inspired to the previous publisher, Erwin Knoll, who did such an incredible job there at the magazine in Madison. So it's an ongoing project. It depends on people just like you and me. There's no big, corporate sugar daddies in the wings that are supporting us. We depend on you. So please support the Progressive, get a copy of this book, and, do what you can to support independent media.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you very much. And Noam Chomsky has now joined us, and I'm going to bring him on the screen and welcome to our event, Professor Noam Chomsky, coming to us from Arizona. So we have a geographic cross-section on the program tonight. And I'm actually going to disappear from the screen and leave the two of you who have been speaking with each other about so many different topics for more than 35 years, and all of that being collected, this current book and the forthcoming book. So let's give a warm welcome now to Professor Noam Chomsky.
Hi.
Hello there, Noam. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Sorry. Apologies for being a little late. I was solid interviews all day, and they keep running a little bit over.
I know the syndrome. Well, let's start with your favorite newspaper, the New York Times. I noticed that in many of our interviews, you begin with a lead story that you saw in the Times. How has the newspaper of record been covering the war in the Ukraine?
Well, the Morning New York Times is always a source of information and fury mixed. So
what's being left out in the Ukraine story?
On Ukraine? Well, I think the New York Times, I applaud them. They had a very fine editorial on Ukraine, which infuriated me. Fine editorial in which, for the first time ever, as far as I can recall, they quoted the wording of the Nuremberg Tribunal. I don't remember an earlier occasion. Very self-righteously quoted the wording which says that aggression is the supreme international crime. Okay, which differs from other war crimes in that it encompasses the I'm getting a lot of noise from somewhere. Do you have it?
Yeah, Norm, is the line clear? Can you hear me, Noam?
Yeah, let me repeat what I said. I'm applauding the New York Times editors for quoting, I think for the first time, the wording of the Nuremberg judgment, which sentenced those accused of mostly hanging because they committed the supreme international crime, which differs from other war crimes in that it encompasses the accumulated evil of the whole, everything that follows. So, for example, it encompasses the instigation of ethnic conflicts that didn't exist before, which then tore the country apart and are tearing the region apart. It encompasses the rise of ISIS with all the atrocities that followed. However, unfortunately, that's not what they were talking about. They were talking about somebody else's carrying out the supreme international crime, and they were properly indignant about it. The official enemy, President Putin, did carry out last February the supreme international crime, comparable in character, not in scale, to the invasion of Iraq, numerous other acts of aggression, which I could mention. So yes, it's proper to denounce it with a great self-righteousness, forgetting the fact that when the US carried out the supreme international crime, actually on a much greater scale, they were praising it. They thought it was fine. In fact, maybe they said it might be a mistake, maybe we didn't think it through properly, but it's certainly not a crime. In fact, I'll just take that one example because it's so egregious. But just for that example, the most recent international crime, which the US carried out, the most egregious one, is never criticized in the United States. In fact, what's called a criticism is when President Obama says it was a strategic blunder. If some Russian official today says that the invasion of Ukraine is a strategic blunder, which of course it is, but we don't praise them for it. In fact, we condemn them bitterly for it and for not agreeing with the New York Times editors that it was the supreme international crime. So yes, I applaud the fact that they finally said it, and occasionally they do, or potential enemies. Be nice if it comes back home sometime. In that respect, they're very much like the Soviet press, which is very indignant about American crimes, often accurately. I don't praise them for that. I don't think you do. We can go on. So, for example, let's talk about something that isn't in the New York Times, but is quite important, or any other newspaper, as far as I know. I don't think the US press, as far as I'm aware, has ever reported one of the most important policy statements of the Biden administration related to the Ukraine conflict. September 1st, 2021, a couple of months, a few weeks before the invasion. This is a statement on the U.S.-Ukraine Strategic Partnership, September 1st, 2021. It calls for providing Ukraine with advanced anti-tank and other weapons with, I'm now quoting, a robust training and exercise program in keeping with Ukraine's status as a NATO enhanced opportunities partner. Goes on to, quoting, finalizing a strategic defense framework that creates a foundation for the enhancement of U.S. Ukraine strategic defense and security cooperation, again within the NATO enhanced opportunity framework. Well, may not have been recorded in the United States, but you can be pretty confident that Russian intelligence read it off the White House official webpage. Maybe, I don't know, but it's possible that this was a factor leading to the decision to move on to the supreme international crime. Possibly. You can imagine, we might try a thought experiment. We might imagine, say, that China had established a huge military system with many other advanced countries as part of it, the most advanced countries in the world, Chinese-based military system aimed at the United States. And suppose that China approached Mexico and said, we are now finalizing a strategic defense framework with Mexico, which will be the foundation for providing advanced weapons to Mexico, and a robust training and exercise program with the People's Liberation Army, in keeping with Mexico's status as an enhanced opportunities partner, joining our international military system. How would the United States react? Well, we don't have to say, because as soon as the first word of this was expressed, Mexico would be blown away. Well, that's what we're telling Russia, and there is a history. It's not out of the blue, okay? Well, I can see why maybe the New York Times and other papers decided not to publish this, but again, we can be pretty confident that the circle around Putin did read it and could draw the conclusions that we would draw if inconceivably something was done like that with a non-existent Chinese huge military system and, say, Mexico.
In terms of the historical background of the conflict, talk about what was called NATO not expanding 1 inch to the east. These were representations made to Gorbachev as the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Warsaw Pact dissolving. Talk about that background, which has gotten very little notice in the media.
Well, since there's been a lot of evasiveness and sometimes even lying about this, I would suggest that anyone interested look at the authoritative National Security Archive online, which has the exact documents, full exact documents with the precise wording. These were agreements between George H.W. Bush, James Baker, Secretary of State on the US side, Mikhail Gorbachev on the Russian side, also Genscher Helmut Kohl in Germany, which was directly involved. The agreement is unambiguous, explicit, no vacillation, clear, unambiguous, says Gorbachev agrees to allow Germany to be unified within NATO hostile military alliance. A little bit of history about Germany and Russia, which I don't have to repeat. It's quite a concession on the part of Russia. But he agreed with the condition stated explicitly and unambiguously by the US side, affirmed by the Germans, that NATO will not expand 1 inch to the east, meaning East Germany. George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, lived up to that promise, didn't abrogate it. When Clinton came into office, he began to vacillate. Actually, the best account of this I know is by one of the most respected and astute members of the U.S. diplomatic service, Ambassador Chas Freeman, who was directly involved in all of these issues at the time and has remained so. In a recent interview, he describes what happens. He himself had been working on trying to institute what was called the Partnership for Peace, which would be a system that President Bush advocated, helped initiate, a system that would bring Russia into some kind of accommodation with the West. It was a loosely formed partnership which had a limited NATO connection but didn't require NATO membership. It was limited association, but a move towards integration of the region in a peaceful alliance. Well, it was being developed up until Clinton. By 1994, Ambassador Freeman describes, Clinton started vacillating, as he puts it, talking out of two sides of his mouth. To the Russians, he was saying, we're living up to the agreement. To the ethnic voting blocs in the United States, like the Polish community, he was saying, don't worry, we're going to bring Poland into NATO. Clinton was a political animal. He had his eye on the elections, 1994, 96, 98. He got a very angry reaction from Boris Yeltsin, who, remember, was his close buddy. Yeltsin was his favorite in Russia. In fact, Clinton intervened directly and proudly, in fact, in the 1996 election to ensure Yeltsin's election. Yeltsin bitterly protested again in 1996. Clinton disregarded it. 1997, probably with an eye on the 1998 vote, he incorporated Poland, Hungary, Slovenia into NATO. Russia objected, couldn't do anything about it. Many other actions, which I don't have time to review, humiliating Russia consciously. George W. Bush II, he tore the whole thing to shreds. He just invited in every country that wanted to along Russia's border. Russians protested, didn't matter. We were the boss. We won the war, they lost, we'll do what we feel like. In 2008, Bush, this is the second Bush, made the reckless decision to invite Ukraine into NATO. It was vetoed by France and Germany, but it stayed on the table under US pressure and remained so, leading ultimately to the Biden statement that I quoted from 2021, and throughout the period moves towards incorporating Ukraine more closely into NATO. This was against the advice of every high-level US official who had any acquaintance with the Eastern European situation. Defense Secretary William Perry, Clinton's defense secretary, came close to resigning in protest out of Clinton's decision to bring the countries into NATO. George Kennan, famously, he's now being quoted, warned against this as extremely dangerous. Same was true of other high-level officials. Jack Matlock, ambassador, Reagan's ambassador, one of the leading Russia specialists, strongly opposed it, warned against it. Current head of the CIA, William Burns, also a Russia specialist, warned against it. Also his predecessor as CIA director, Stansfield Turner. Just about every high-level diplomat who knew anything about it, and a long list of government advisors warned against this all the way. They pointed out that Russia will tolerate a lot, but they have a red line. They're not going to tolerate NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine, right within their geostrategic heartland. That was understood on all sides. The US went ahead. Most recent step was the September 2021 policy statement that I read, that I quoted from before. Well, doesn't justify Putin's carrying out the supreme international crime. There's no justification for that. But it's worth thinking about. And it's also worth thinking through the thought experiment that I mentioned about the unimaginable, inconceivable possibility of China and Mexico doing something similar.
Well, talk about also the Trump administration withdrawing from the INF Treaty in 2018. Now, that had a big impact on Moscow.
Sorry, could you repeat? I didn't
The
hear
INF Treaty in 2018 that the U.S. withdrew from. You're not hearing me?
I'm here. It's not clear, I'm afraid. Maybe it would help if you put it up in the chat. Can you do that? I think.
Let's see. I was asking you about the INF Treaty.
About the
INF Treaty the U.S. withdrew from in 2018.
The 2018?
Yeah.
Sorry, 1 second.
Is that muted? If you touch
Delirium.
Try down.
Yeah. How's that, Noam? Is that better?
The INF.
Yes.
That was one of many direct threats to Russia. Now we're up to Donald Trump. The two Republican presidents in this millennium have been tearing apart what's left of the arms control regime. Started with George W. Bush. I think it was 2004. Dismantled the ABM treaty that banned anti-ballistic missiles. A very dangerous move and a major threat to Russia, because the point of it was to allow the United States to place ABM systems virtually on the Russian border. These are basically first strike systems. They can't possibly deter a first strike. Everyone knows that. It's conceivable they might deter a retaliatory strike. Every strategic analyst on all sides knows that they're a first strike weapon. Furthermore, they can easily be refigured, to include offensive missiles. So they were a major threat to Russia. Bush dismantled the treaty. It's also a threat to us, but that's not a consideration. Donald Trump came along and used his famous wrecking ball to destroy whatever else he could. One was the treaty you mentioned, the INF Treaty, the Reagan-Gorbachev Treaty of 1987, which banned short-range missiles in Europe. This was a major step towards international peace. Missiles 5 to 10 minutes from Moscow, Pershing missiles, are a major threat to peace. remember that Russia is a weak country. It's a poor, weak country. Its economy is on the scale of Italy and Spain. It happens to have major weapons, but nothing much else. Its warning systems for under attack are old-fashioned radar-based systems, only reach to the horizon. Gives Russian analysts a couple of minutes to decide whether a warning is real or an accident, and there are many accidents. Well, the INF Treaty improved that enormously by banning short-range missiles. Trump got rid of it. Also got rid of the Open Skies Treaty. Goes back to Eisenhower, the last conservative president, the Open Skies Treaty gave both sides information about the other's plans, also a major contribution to world peace. He was about to destroy the New START Treaty, the last remaining treaty, which puts a limit on nuclear weapons. Fortunately, he was voted out just in time. Biden was able to save that treaty literally by a few days. It was meant to expire on February 5th, 2021, so that remains. But Trump did what he could to destroy the remaining treaties, including enhancing threats to Russia. And he tried to make it very clear to Russia that he meant these threats. So when in August 2018, when he dismantled the INF Treaty, immediately, within days, the US launched missiles violating the treaty, telling Russia, I'm not just talking, I mean it. I'm putting dangerous missiles, I've developed dangerous missiles aiming at you a couple of minutes from Moscow. That was the word to Moscow. Of course, they reacted. They're not nice guys themselves by any means. They're criminal leadership. We saw it again in the invasion of Ukraine, but they're also trying to defend themselves. If China put missiles in Mexico aiming at Washington, we wouldn't like it very much. We'd do something about it.
Talk about the position of China, India, and Israel on the invasion of Ukraine.
Well, you can get a sense of this, a good sense, by looking at a map of sanctions. Who imposes sanctions on Russia? It's a very interesting map. Take a look at it. You can pick it up on the internet. The sanctions are imposed by the English-speaking countries, by Europe, and by those who apartheid South Africa called honorary whites, Japan, its former colonies, South Korea and Taiwan. That's sanctions, not the rest of the world. The rest of the world is condemning the invasion as a crime, but basically asking, what's the fuss? This is what you guys do all the time. We're the victims of it. We know about it. So yes, we deplore it, we condemn it, and we're glad that you finally see that there's something wrong with violent aggression in violation of the Nuremberg principles and international law. Glad that you see it, but we're not getting excited about it. That's basically the global South, by now the last more or less civilized part of the world. Well, what about China? What about India? India is just standing aloof. They don't want to antagonize Russia. They don't want to antagonize China. They have their own interests. So they deplore it, but don't go beyond that. Take China. China, pretty much the same position. If you look at the Chinese press, it's actually supporting Russia. It's repeating Chinese propaganda. Russian propaganda, as far as I can tell. We can't really tell because the United States has banned all Russia-based systems of so-called information systems. So we can't get it directly, but you can read Al Jazeera, which reports a Russian public, Chinese and Russian public information. So China seems to be pretty much reiterating the Russian propaganda line. But like the rest of the global South, they're standing aloof. Now, China, unlike India and other countries, could play a role, a significant role, in bringing the Ukraine crime to an end. They could begin to take part in serious negotiations, which might lead to what everybody knows is the possible outcome. They're not doing it. Well, others should criticize them from this, but Americans are in no position to criticize them because they are taking the same position as the United States. The United States is refusing to enter into negotiations which might lead to an outcome, to a peaceful outcome to the problem. Quote, Ambassador Freeman again, one of the most respected figures of the diplomatic service, as he put it a couple of days ago, the American position is to fight to the last Ukrainian, but to do nothing to move to terminate the crisis. And he goes on further to say that it's worse. The United States is actually accelerating the crisis. He repeats what anybody who thinks for a minute would know when President Biden accuses Putin as being a war criminal, says your only choice is to go to The Hague, when that's reiterated by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Your only choice is to go to The Hague, your back is to the wall, no way out. When he does that, he's telling Putin and his circle of hard men that you might as well go for broke. You've got no choice. No matter what happens, you're finished. No chance to escape. So might as well use the capacities we have to destroy Ukraine and maybe threaten a nuclear war, because you've given us no other choice. I happen to be quoting Ambassador Freeman, pretty much paraphrasing, but it's pretty obvious. Any analyst in the world can see it. So China is basically following the US position, but not as extreme as the United States. It's not pushing for the destruction of Ukraine and the move towards possible international war, meaning terminal war. Well, what China's doing is bad enough, but we're not much positioned to charge them for it. We have to pay attention to what's happening here, which we can do something about. It's criminal for the United States to be taking this position. We may ask why China and the United States are taking the position that they are, namely fighting to the last Ukrainian, and in the US positions, in the US case, even accelerating the destruction. Well, can speculate, but a possibility is that Chinese and American leaders are not too dissatisfied with the course of the war. In China's case, it's driving Russia into the hands of China to become a subordinate to the expanding Chinese global system, mostly an investment and loan system, which is huge, bringing in much of the world. Now Russia's being brought into it as a subordinate, weak country, declining criminal kleptocracy, which does have lots of raw materials and can provide them probably at bargain prices when Western markets dry up. So for China, that's fine. Can also provide heavy weapons. What about the United States? Well, Putin and his criminal foolishness provided the United States with an enormous gift. He handed the United States Europe on a silver platter. He thrust Europe deep into the pocket of the United States. If there had been anyone in the Kremlin with a limited resemblance to a statesman, he would have seized the opportunity to draw Europe, France and Germany, draw them into an accommodation with Russia in something like the Gorbachev vision of a European common home. They have plenty of reasons to do that. Commercial relations, security reasons, very much to their advantage. US, of course, is strongly opposed, but might not have worked. But a statesman in the Kremlin would have tried it and even had some opportunities with Macron's limited efforts at interchange with Putin. But instead, they did what you expect of violent autocrats: reach for the guns, don't think about a diplomatic settlement that would require statesmanship. Gift to the United States, very harmful to itself. Remember that, not talked about much here, but this is a issue that has been alive all throughout the Cold War. Back to the end of the Second World War, there's been a major issue about the status of Europe. Europe's had choices. One choice was to join in subordination to the United States within what's called the Atlanticist framework, meaning basically NATO. US sets the rules, gives the orders, Europe obeys. That's one possibility. The other option was for Europe to move to become what was called a third force, an independent force in world affairs, not subordinate to the United States. That was basically Charles de Gaulle's proposal. For, as he put it, a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, including Russia, with no military alliances. US was strongly opposed. Became starkly apparent in 1990-1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The discussions that we discussed earlier, Gorbachev proposed, again, a European common home, no military alliances, accommodating Russia and the West within a commercial security framework independent of US control. Well, Putin didn't try. It might have succeeded. It would have averted the invasion of Ukraine and led to a much different world, a better world, in my opinion. But Russia instead moved at once to criminal aggression. And the United States, I'm sure, is applauding, because it gave the United States exactly the gift that it wants: a subordinated Europe, totally obedient to the United States, now moving towards militarization. Great joy in the offices of Lockheed Martin, the other arms producers. Europe getting massive arms that doesn't need for any purpose except enriching arms manufacturers. The fossil fuel companies are overjoyed. The Ukraine invasion is an enormous gift to them. It gets these annoying environmentalists out of their hair, as they are now saying openly. They want to be loved. They want to be hugged, as they put it, because they are now free to expand the use of fossil fuels and even get lauded for it, because they're saving civilization by racing as quickly as possible towards destruction of the environment. That's the world we're living in, okay? We can pretend it's otherwise, but that's the way it is. So the US hawks, military system, fossil fuel industries, other major parts of the corporate sector are delighted. China probably sees it to its advantage. So the US is therefore continuing to fight to the last Ukrainian, avoiding the chances to do something to end these horrors, in fact, escalating them. And China is not using the measures that it could to try to help put an end to these horrors. That's what we're facing right now.
Certainly, the war in Ukraine has actually pushed deep into the back pages very important reports coming from the UN IPCC in the last few weeks. Those things have been relegated to page 12 or 18, the back pages of the newspapers. These are very critical developments about the future of humanity and the planet.
Well, the future of the human species, and in fact life on Earth, is in a very fragile situation now. A couple of days ago, I think it was April 4th, the IPCC, the International Community of Scientists, came out with another formal statement assessing the state of the environment, the most dire statement they have made so far. Extreme statement, warning that we must begin right now to cut back substantially the use of fossil fuels, fixed amount every year till within a couple of decades, we have ended their use. If we don't do that, we're heading directly to tipping points, irreversible tipping points, where processes will begin to take shape that can no longer be controlled and will lead to the kind of environmental destruction which will make life not worth living for those who manage to survive. That's the warning of April 4th. That's in the back pages and quickly disappearing. And the front pages are, we have to increase fossil fuel production. We have to laud, hug the fossil fuel companies because they're saving civilization by maximizing the production of fossil fuels. We have to build new facilities to provide liquefied natural gas to Europe. Has nothing to do with Ukraine or Russia. Won't even be available for years, but we have to prepare for it. We have to race for disaster. And the most evil demon you can imagine couldn't have put together a situation like this. But that's the reality.
Where do you see NATO evolving into as a military alliance threatening Russia and other countries to its east?
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Could you say it again?
NATO's evolution into a kind of strike force for U.S. imperialism.
Afraid I can't hear it.
Can you hear me now?
Could you put it in the chat?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Okay,
How
now
about this?
Yeah, could you say it again?
Yeah, I'll speak up. Yeah. The evolution of NATO into a military, well, it is a military alliance, but how that threatens the interests of Russia. It's only the United States and its allies that have national security interests. Designated enemies such as Russia or Syria or North Korea, they don't have national interests.
So NATO as a strike force for imperialism. What about that? Well, NATO, during the period when the Soviet Union still existed, you could claim, at least with some limited credibility, that NATO was a defensive alliance. Not very much credibility, in my opinion, but at least it wasn't absurd. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, that ended. It's not a defensive alliance. There's no Soviet Union, no Soviet threat. That was actually recognized right away by the first Bush administration. It's very interesting to read their public positions around 1990, 91. There was a new national security strategy. There were budget proposals, and they're very interesting to read. What they say is, well, Soviet Union's collapsed, but we have to maintain an advanced and expand our military force, not because of the Russians, but because of what they called the technological sophistication of third world powers. I'm not making this up. Because of the technological sophistication of third world powers, we have to maintain this massive military system. We have to maintain what they call the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry, which rests very highly on government subsidy. So we have to maintain that. And the most interesting part was intervention forces. We have to maintain intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. And then comes this interesting phrase, where the serious threats we faced could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. In other words, sorry, folks, we've been lying to you for 70 years. It wasn't the Russians that made us have major intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. It was what we call radical nationalism, moves towards independence that we don't like. And that's it. And we have to maintain intervention forces for that. There was a brief period when the cloud lifted and you could see stated clearly what policies were. Didn't last long. Pretty soon the cloud came back with NATO being a defensive alliance, although its actions were offensive. Its actions were bombing Serbia in 1991, purposely a Russian ally, bombing undertaken in a manner to be of maximal humiliation to Russia. The Russians weren't even informed. There was a pretext for the bombing. Pretext was it's humanitarian intervention. We have to bomb to stop Serb atrocities. And in order to back up this story, there's been a huge propaganda campaign which inverts the chronology, claims that NATO intervened to stop the Serb atrocities, when in fact, the Serb atrocities, which were very real, were the anticipated and predicted consequence of NATO bombing. That is substantiated with solid documentation from the best possible sources, OSCE observers on the ground, many others. But it doesn't matter. The story that's needed is inversion of the chronology. So that's what you read. So this was straight NATO aggression with no pretext.
No, we're running out of time. So just in the moments we have left, Talk about the importance of such independent voices as the Progressive magazine and how vital it is to public discourse.
Let me just add another sentence about that. Then came further interventions, but let's look at NATO's official policy. NATO's official policy is it must protect energy sources throughout the world, energy sources and pipelines. That means NATO can do anything anywhere around the world. That's not a defensive alliance, and its activities show that. The NATO bombing of Libya, in violation of Security Council orders that NATO itself had instituted, not defensive. In fact, just a fraud. Strike force for imperialism, of course. Okay, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Talk about, in the moment we have left, the importance of independent voices like the Progressive magazine.
This one.
Independent voices like the Progressive magazine and their importance. Still can't hear me?
I'm sorry, but I can't hear. Okay.
Yeah, we're having
independent voices in the world.
Yes, yeah, in like the Progressive magazine.
Well, the Global South is an
Yes.
independent voice. In fact, the leading independent voice. What they're saying is, in the United States, of course, there are independent voices. We're right now celebrating one of them, the Progressive magazine. Long history, back to Fighting Bob as an independent voice, independent critical voice. There are some others. Democracy Now! In These Times, Intercept. There are internet sites.
Radio.
Dreams, Truth Out, others. There are independent voices, and they make a big difference. They had better be kept alive. They're at the margins. They don't get major contributions from big corporations. They're not owned by major super rich magnates like Rupert Murdoch. They have to be supported by individuals who hope that democracy and human rights and decency can somehow survive this onslaught. So those are independent voices, plus the books that you have in your hand.
Indeed, indeed. Chronicles of Dissent, a collection of 3 books that we did in the 1980s and 1990s, Keeping the Rabble in Line, Chronicles of Dissent, and Class Warfare. It's all a benefit for the Progressive magazine and this wonderful independent bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin. Maybe just one last quick question, Noam. A lot of people wondering, how you doing? How are things in Arizona? How are you holding up?
I'm getting it by typing because I can't hear.
People are wondering how you're holding up. How's your health? How are your spirits? Still can't hear me? I'm sorry, we're having this technical difficulty. Yes.
Okay. My doctors tell me I'm a phenomenon for 1993, so I guess I'm okay. My animal.
Take good care. Norm, you want to take it over?
Yes. I want to thank both of you so very much for being with us tonight for this this wonderful event. Again, the book Chronicles of Dissent, as David mentioned, you can get with a donation to the Progressive magazine. You can also subscribe to the Progressive through our website, progressive.org. and see all of this particular issue that's just come out. Among other things, it includes a review of your daughter's book, Professor Chomsky. Your daughter, Aviva Chomsky, has a wonderful new book on climate change, and there's a review of that in this issue, along with many, many other tremendous articles. I encourage people to check it out. Please feel free to contact us anytime. You can go to the website and get the contact information, and we're happy to talk with you. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks to A Room of One's Own bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin, for co-sponsoring this event, and undying gratitude to Professor Noam Chomsky for his 93 plus years of activism, and David Barsamian for his many years of radio programming at alternativeradio.org.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.